so glad to see you here, that you made it through the blockade out front for the Chinese. But we're very happy to have you here. My name is Rod Dreher. I work here at the Danube Institute, and I'm here to welcome you on behalf of my colleagues John O'Sullivan and Istvan Kiss, neither of whom were able to be here tonight. Our guest tonight is a German-British historian and journalist, Katja, who is a visiting research fellow at King's College London. I'm going to allow our friend Will Collins to tell you a little bit more about her, but please join me in welcoming both Katja and Will.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I first had a chance to get to know Katja's work because I reviewed her wonderful book, Beyond the Wall, for the Washington Examiner, an American magazine. And if you are thinking about picking up a copy, or if you're interested in it at all, I highly recommend it, because it's not just a window into Cold War rivalries or the geopolitics of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, although there's plenty of that stuff in there. It's also a really interesting and full spectrum look at East German society from the late 40s to 1989, and it explores some of the long-term legacy of the East German state. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, not just politics or foreign policy or the things that we typically associate with East German history. For example, I was introduced to the subgenre of Ostrock, which is the distinctly East German rock genre that grew up behind the wall in response to the influence of Western pop culture. There was the example of Dean Reed, who was better known as Red Elvis. He was this American pop star who decided to defect to East Germany and became kind of a cultural icon beyond the wall, as it were. So there are all sorts of interesting little vignettes and anecdotes from the people who lived in East Germany from the 1940s to the 1980s. You get a really interesting sense of what it was like to live in that society and why it still matters. And so I highly recommend, if you get a chance, to pick up Katja's book, and she's going to talk a little bit more in depth about it right now. After that, I'm going to ask her a few questions, and then we're going to open this up to the audience and see if anybody else has anything to say. So Katja, take it away.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So maybe I'll just say a few words about myself as well, so you get some sort of idea as to where this book fits in. So I was just about still born in East Germany in 1985. So that makes me 4 years old when the Berlin Wall fell, 5 years old when Germany reunified. And for me, it was always very strange looking back at kind of my origins with the feeling of I'm from somewhere that doesn't exist anymore. It's just a very strange feeling to look at a map and not find your place of birth on it. That also applies to the city that I was born in, which is Guben. It's one of the cities that was divided by the Oder-Neisse line after the Second World War on the German-Polish border. And at the time I was born there, it was called Wilhelm-Pieck-Stadt, Guben, after the first and only president of the GDR. So it still says in my British passport today, I was born in Wilhelm-Pieck-Stadt, Guben. So neither the kind of city nor the actual country I was from still exist as such anymore. And that kind of, even from a very young age, gave me a lot of cause to think about German history and how it sort of doesn't really fit together. So especially as I live in Britain now, where people will say something like, we were invaded by the French, and they mean, 1066 basically. So they're talking about this we going 1,000 years back. That doesn't work in Germany. You wouldn't even refer to we when you mean something, certainly when you're from East Germany as such. You wouldn't even mean something, kind of 40 years ago referring to that. German history kind of comes in these parcels. You talk about the Weimar Republic, Nazi Germany, West Germany, East Germany, the Kaiserreich. So you have these sort of chapters of German history that almost end quite often on a particular day, and then a new kind of Germany starts the next day, and that is kind of what happened to me and my own family, if you will, in 1990. So this is me kind of going back as a person to look at the country that I'm from, and kind of just being curious, really, what was it like. But also I grew up with a really keen sense, that German history German history writing hasn't finished yet, hasn't found an adequate way, I think, to sort of deal with these things. So this is also me as a historian looking at where does East Germany fit into the German story? Is it kind of a full-blown chapter, or as I feel so far, it's kind of been treated almost as the side story really to the proper Germany, which is West Germany. So this is my attempt to sort of go back, treat the country as a serious, kind of study subject, if you will, not just as a kind of counter foil to the West German example, but actually look at it kind of in its own right. Also look at it through the decades. So I start basically well before the foundation of 1949, and then look at kind of every decade, every year really within that history, to see also how it changed, because I think quite often when people think East Germany, they have this kind of static image of the country in their minds as well, whilst it did actually change a lot. So this was sort of my approach to it. And then I took Angela Merkel as an example, as arguably the most famous East German, basically, and started my whole approach with her, because she said at some point, I think it was in 2005, just before she became Chancellor, and she was asked about something to do with East Germany, and she kind of just rolled her eyes and said, well, I think it's impossible to tell people what it was like back then, how we lived, to explain it to people and make it understandable. So I took that as a little challenge, and I thought, is it really impossible to tell people who aren't from East Germany what it was like to be in that country, and what it was like for society kind of going through? So I wrote this book explicitly in English, even though German is my mother tongue, because the idea was basically to try and open this world up to an audience that isn't from there. And in order to do that, I felt I needed a kind of like a more human approach to it. So each and every chapter starts with a little vignette, basically, of somebody who experienced something. That doesn't mean that the entire book's about daily life. There's a lot of high politics in there as well. So I do the same thing with the politicians, basically. So I'll, go to see how Walter Ulbricht tried to deal with the big uprising of 1953 by literally zooming in there and kind of looking at what was happening behind the scenes there. How did they try and respond to that? So the idea is basically to take the reader with me to give a concrete example of the stuff that happened, and then kind of zoom out from there and explain politics and economics and social stuff and daily life, as you mentioned, with culture, for example, as well. So it's quite an ambitious project that looks a lot smaller in paperback than it actually is. So it's, it turned out in the end to be over 500 pages, even though I set out for it to be much shorter, because there was just so much to it, and I found out kind of bits and pieces that I didn't know about as well, and came out, I think, with a slightly different image of the GDR myself as well. It's not a revisionist history of the GDR, as it's often been called by more left-wing papers, which made me cringe every time. Like The Guardian, I think, started with a big headline sort of saying, finally somebody comes up with the human face of socialism, and that phrase alone just made me sort of cringe, because that was really not the idea of it. Meanwhile, you had, I think it was the Daily Mail said, more sordid tales from behind the Iron Curtain. That was also not the idea, but I'm glad that people found something in the book that is relevant to them, basically. So that was exactly what I'd kind of aimed for. The response has been almost as interesting as writing the book. So it's been out for about a year now. Came out in English at first, and then in several, I think we're on 15 languages now. And each country almost where it came out as well has had a very, very different response to the book. So for example, I was in Ireland last year talking about this book, and all the questions that came up were about unification. People wanted to know, what does it work, basically bringing a people and a country back together, even though for political reasons, the country's been split for a very long time. So people felt that was kind of the main thing. How does a nation kind of live in two states? I was talking to people in Finland about it, where the book also came out and contributed, unbeknownst to me, really, that wasn't the idea, but it contributed to a debate in Finland where, because they've just joined NATO, there's a huge debate going on around, should the Finnish authorities release basically the files of the Secret Service about who worked with the Stasi at the time. Because Finland obviously had this very hybrid position in the Cold War, where they were sitting between the two blocks, worked very, very closely with the GDR on a number of things, most famously perhaps the education system. And as a result of that, many politicians who are still, kind of active today and working today also worked at the time with the Stasi and with the authorities in East Germany. So they're having a huge debate around, should these people kind of be unmasked or kind of revealed, and again this book played into that, and it's not something that I'd really anticipated, how much there is to kind of East German history that is relevant to so many other countries. More recently, it's come out in a few Eastern European countries as well, which is an interesting debate. So Poland and the Czech Republic, for example, and there obviously I'm talking, with the book that was really distinctly aimed at a Western audience to an audience that sort of knows what I'm talking about. And that's again an interesting debate, same as in East Germany when I go there and speak to people about it, where quite often I get emails kind of sent to me saying, oh, finally somebody's looking at these aspects, that have previously not been looked at, things like culture and so on. But on page 257, you could have highlighted something that is really important to me. And I realized then, this is still very much a live issue. And that's maybe a bit naive because I'm younger than a lot of the people obviously in the book. But I hadn't quite realized just how emotional this topic still is for people who actually live through this era as well and recognize or don't recognize things that I talk about in there. And accordingly, the book was incredibly controversial, still is incredibly controversial in Germany itself, where it's hit last year basically when it came out, it hit right into a new East-West debate that was going on. There was another huge book last year by a guy called Dirk Oschmann, who's a literature professor actually, but also an East German, and every time he was supposed to come on a panel, people said, oh, we need another East German here. He was sort of saying, well, I'm a literature professor. I work on 17th century poetry. I don't really want to come on this panel to speak about East Germany. And he got so fed up with this over the years that he wrote a really, really angry sort of treatise about the way that East Germans have been treated, in his opinion, since 1990. And it just exploded last year. It sold over 150,000 copies in Germany, and most of them in the East, perhaps unsurprisingly, and people got very, very irate about it. I've done 2 events with them, and it is just bizarre when you stand there, at the end, basically, and people come up to talk to you. There are people sort of stood in front of him with tears in their eyes saying, finally somebody's expressing my anger, but equally very controversial because a lot of people are also saying that that's not how I feel, and so why are you writing this very irrational and angry book about this as well? So, again, I had no idea that this was going on before this book came out, literally right in the middle of that debate as well. So this has turned into a bizarre thing that is now the Hoyer-Oschmann debate, where there's supposedly, I'm not angry, but I'm kind of put into this category now, and people are saying, well, this is kind of like the Empire writes back sort of thing. Now East Germany writes back. Sort of debate going on in Germany as well. So this has been really fascinating, even for me, to just observe what this book has done to people worldwide and how it's been received. I have literally just set out to try, as I say, to try and kind of uncover the whole of East German history. I had no idea that this meant so much to so many people in so many different ways, and also in such an emotional way. So that has indeed been very interesting. And one aspect, maybe just as a last point before we get into the debate, maybe that is relevant to Hungary as well, I think, is this idea that a lot of the people who brought down the GDR in the end in 1989 and sort of fought against the regime were dissidents and really wanted Westernization basically of East Germany and wanted to become part of the West German system, are now the harshest critics of that system and have kind of almost turned the other way and have become very illiberal in many cases in their outlook. So, for example, the AfD, the right-wing party in Germany, their rhetoric in the East, and it's incredibly effective. So, at the moment, there are or elections coming up in 3 East German states in the autumn, in which the AfD is the leader in all 3 of them, in all 3 states. And the sort of, when you look at election posters or the campaigns that they use, it's all about kind of perpetuating the peaceful revolution of 1989. So rather than what is sort of the common logic in West Germany, where they say all these people are all kind of socialized by dictatorships and therefore they want a dictatorship back, their rhetoric is actually the other way around. They're sort of saying, well, we fought a dictatorship in 1989, we brought it down, And now again, the government's trying to tell us how to think and what to do, so we need to bring this dictatorship down as well. That's sort of the line that they use. So they use terms like Wende 2.0, so the peaceful revolution 2.0, complete the peaceful revolution, that kind of thing. The East rises up again. They also go out on Mondays, which used to be the thing in 1989. There were Monday demonstrations to bring down the East German states, and now they do Monday demonstrations. So it's very interesting. I think it's the same sort of dynamics that you see here as well with Viktor Orban having been a very popular sort of dissident and opposition leader, and now also kind of more critical about westernization and liberal tendencies. And I think those kinds of things apply to other Eastern European countries as well, those dynamics. And it's just, again, an interesting dimension where these things have become relevant again when people thought that chapter was closed in 1990, and it clearly isn't.
Well, that nicely sets up my first question, because I think those are some interesting connections that you're drawing between Hungary and East Germany and maybe some other Eastern European countries of the former Eastern Bloc, like Poland. I'm curious, why do you think these countries are such fertile territory for that conservative right populist message? Why do you think that resonates so much, not just in East Germany, but throughout a lot of these countries that have had similar political, social, and economic experiences over the past few generations?
Well, I think it's a complex thing. I think it's got economic reasons as well as political ones. But one of the things I would say is quite often this line is taken that people just don't really understand Western democracy, and therefore they're not feeling at home. And it's in German, they often use this phrase, they haven't arrived yet, these people. So by that they mean arrived in Westernism, arrived in democracy. And that I don't think is the case. I think in most Western countries, when people, and I can speak for Britain in particular, where when people are unhappy with the democratic offering that is there, with the parties that are on offer, they tend to kind of hold their nose and then go and vote anyway, or stay at home and not vote, but it doesn't really turn into an outright hostility against the state or against its structures, because people have, I think, got used to the idea that democracy isn't a set of ideal choices from which one of them must be exactly what you want, and they kind of get used to the idea that even if they like none of the options, the whole system in itself doesn't get questioned. I think when you're kind of new to the system and you come into this and you've longed literally for decades for that to arrive, and you've been sold and told that this is a perfect democracy basically in which the people get what they want, you're more disappointed in it, and you begin to question the whole idea of it more. I think that's the reason behind this. And many of these people, when you speak to them, they'll tell you they're quite nostalgic actually about the late 1980s when their fight was on. Basically, there was something to fight for. There was a kind of grassroots democracy thing going on where they would organize themselves in groups and opposition in the sort of scene and work together and then actually achieve something by overthrowing the system or by reforming it, as is the case elsewhere, like in Hungary, for example. And so as a result, these people feel that back then there was kind of more people power in the actual sense, in that they kind of went out, they had activism and those kinds of things, and they achieved something with that. Whilst now a lot of these people feel kind of unheard and kind of sidelined or stigmatized by what they perceive to be sort of the elites. And in that, I think it plays into what's happening in, say, in the US and in Britain and in France as well, in that you have got this dynamic between countryside, city, elites, the people, and all of that's also going on, I think. But on top of that, I think you have a kind of disillusionment with westernization and with what was supposed to be normal, that they don't accept kind of as normal and carry on sort of fighting for.
Yeah, that's very interesting and definitely very relevant. To explore those parallels a bit more, one of the things that I thought was really interesting in your book is how you delved into the everyday lived experience of people in East Germany, and not just the high politics, although you do plenty of that too. And of course, Hungary had a reputation as being, I think the phrase was, the happiest barracks in the Eastern Bloc. After 1956, people tended to refer to Hungary as sort of almost a third way between East and West, a little softer, kinder, gentler socialism. And I was wondering, because before reading your book, when I thought of East Germany, I thought of the Stasi, the wall, these other repressive features of East German society. But you talk a lot about the culture of East Germany and the social services and the other things the state provided. Are there some parallels maybe that we've missed previously between the kinder, gentler goulash communism in Hungary and how the GDR dealt with its citizens?
I don't like to contrast the two, as in, try and sort of find a way and say, well, it wasn't quite as extreme as that in terms of Stasi and so on. I think both of these things existed at the same time, and they don't need to be sort of weighed up against each other. It's perfectly possible for somebody to sit in a Stasi prison and be exposed to lies and these so-called water cells where they tortured people, or sleep deprivation, those sorts of things that happen at the same time as other people being grateful for more childcare and for houses being built and for the education system to get better. So I think this is one of the reasons why it's so controversial in Germany in particular, is because it's quite easy to pick a chapter out of my book and say, why'd you talk about house building at this point? And then quote from that and say, why are you making this look like a socialist utopia? And then my answer's always the same, go to the next page and read about the Stasi or about the, other suppression that was going on. Because I think, especially when you look, for instance, at the 1960s, so in 1961 the wall was built, and that, of course, brought huge misery with it. And I've got sort of, a whole chapter there of people who were so desperate to go over to the other side that they risked literally their lives to get there. But then on the flip side, you speak to other people who didn't live in Berlin and who had no intention of going away, and they'll talk about the 1960s as a kind of time period where things were opening up and things were getting more progressive. And those two things seem to be contrasting. But it isn't really, when you think about the regime suddenly sitting there and thinking, right, we've locked people in now. We really don't want another mass uprising like the one in 1953, because this time the Soviets won't come running and helping us. So we do need to now make sure that we appease these people enough so that we don't get another sort of mass uprising. So suddenly a lot of the money is funneled into social care and into those sorts of things. And they exist at the same time. So I think the difference really to Hungary and also other Eastern European countries is that Germany, as ever, is a very kind of rule-based, very disciplined sort of society where if the regime wants people to kind of live a certain way, it'll funnel a lot of resources into that. So the Stasi, I don't think you can compare that to any of the other secret police systems that were built up anywhere. It's the third largest, for instance, even in terms of as a foreign spy agency, it's the third largest after the KGB and the CIA at this point. For a country that small, that's enormous, the amount of money that goes into that. That's, I think, in a way, a very German thing. These people have all been trained in Moscow, the German communists, on how to do these things. They come back, and you still, even right at the end, have people like Erich Mielke, who's the chief of the Stasi, sort of in charge of these systems, when he is somebody that was trained in Moscow during the 1930s. He went through the Second World War, experienced all of that, is completely out of touch with people at that point, when it's when the young generation wants to kind of move onwards and reform things. And I think the level of suppression is much, much higher in the GDR than it was elsewhere. And I hear this time and again when I speak to people from Poland, for example, where there's a real culture of kind of doing things subversively. You kind of just meet in groups and you kind of get around the state in a different way. In East Germany, I think the state kind of realized that was going on and then found ways of still infiltrating people's lives, be that through informants or otherwise. But at the same time, it also realized that you need to keep people reasonably happy and therefore raise living standards and allow them enough room, say, in culture and elsewhere to kind of still be a kind of independent community as such, so that they still have some agency left.
That's interesting, because you actually have some personal experience with this, right? Your father actually got into trouble because of a joke he made, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that a little bit, because I think it gives the audience a really interesting view in how this worked at the ground level. Yeah.
So this isn't a kind of memoir or a personal history of the GDR in any shape or form. But I did kind of sneak myself in there as one of the vignettes. So there's little Katja in 1989 with some memories in there. And I also talked to my own parents about their experience. And I think you could safely say that they were people who had arranged themselves with the system, where both my father was an officer in the East German Air Force and my mother was a teacher. So you can't get any more adapted really to the system as such. But even so, when they were training for one of the big parades, basically for the Day of the Republic, which was the 7th of October every year, there's a big parade in East Berlin going on. And when my father was an officer trainee, basically they went out there to East Berlin at night on the Karl Marx alley to try and sort of practice this march, and it was impressed on them that if anything goes wrong, they're in big trouble. So there were all of these sort of young men in the early 1980s thinking, oh, we better get this right. And as there was sort of some nervous banter on the troop transport to East Berlin, my dad said something stupid along the lines of, well, if this all goes wrong, we might as well kill ourselves or shoot ourselves, something like that. And then the lorry hadn't even arrived with the troops. You know, the door just kind of opened and there were already 2 non-uniformed Stasi officers there who were taking him away and basically taking him back to his base and interrogating him. And then he was put in solitary confinement for nearly 2 weeks, I think it was 10 days. Which nearly broke him because he was literally just in a dark cell for this whole time, didn't know when he was going to come out or what was happening to him for a stupid joke like that. He didn't then leave, so I think that also tells you, this kind of the complexity of the lives that people led in the GDR. He didn't leave the military for that; he stayed in it. But he did refuse to join the party because, I mean, he said to me, you wouldn't believe this, they let me back out after all this time. I had no idea how much time had passed. And in this greatest moment of sort of despair and humiliation, they asked him to join the party. And he was like, that's not happening. So they basically said to him, well, if you don't join the party, you can't stay in your unit, because he was dealing with very sort of sensitive radio technology and those sorts of things. But all that happened is they put him in a different unit and he was constantly sort of surveyed. They also suggested to him not to marry my mother. So, it just goes to show how much, how intrusive this whole system was as well, because she had relatives in West Germany. And so they basically said to him, look, you're an Air Force officer, we'll never let you fly, ever, if you marry a woman who's got relatives in West Germany. And he went, well, fine, married her anyway. Good for me, as I'm here. But yeah, so these things, I think, go to show that it's not as simple as to say somebody was a victim or perpetrator or they've kind of arranged themselves with the system. I think the vast majority of East Germans kind of lived between those extremes and found ways of dealing with the system one way or another. There are, of course, the absolute dissidents who fought and even to their own, risking their own lives at times. And you have these kind of complete ideologues at the other end who sort of joined politics and wanted to really support the system and go with it completely. But I think they're both minorities at each end, maybe sort of 10% or so each. And the vast majority of people live these lives somewhere in between the two extremes, and my own family is no exception to that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting personal touch, and it really highlights some of the themes in the book. On a happier note, I thought I would ask you about the interesting status of Berlin, which was once, of course, this Cold War battleground, and the home of the forbidding Berlin Wall and all that stuff. But today, a few decades later, has now become the destination party city in Europe. It's got this reputation as epicenter of the techno music scene. People go there from all over. The lingua franca, I've heard, is now English instead of German because it's so cosmopolitan. And it's really fascinating for a city that was once so highly contested. So what happened there? How did that transformation occur after the Cold War? And what do you think the future holds for the city?
I think to a certain extent it's had that reputation for a long time. So when you look at the 1920s, when it was really the center of sort of avant-garde culture, and you have people like Christopher Isherwood, famously sort of moving there and then writing about the experience. So I think even then it had a reputation for being a place where you can be free and where you can do what you want and nobody cares really. And I don't think that's changed very much throughout. And then even during the Cold War, West Berlin becomes this hub of people who want to kind of live differently, if you will, very left-wing as well. Famously because it wasn't technically part of West Germany either. So Berlin was still an occupied city and remained as such throughout this whole time. So because of that, if you wanted to evade the draft basically in West Germany as a young man, you'd go there. So that meant lots of kind of very left-leaning, students and so on would basically arrive in West Berlin. Famously, people like David Bowie, who came to Berlin with Iggy Pop to get off drugs, which was maybe not the best place to do that. But yeah, so all of this is I think happening during the Cold War as well, and very much associated with what people think of as kind of Berlin. I mean, even if you want to go even further back, even the Nazis were complaining about the sort of debauchery that was going on there. They called it Red Berlin. So it was always kind of between, well, it's communist, but it's also too kind of bohemian in its outlook. And as a result of that, they invested a lot of kind of time, both in terms of propaganda and then architecture, to try and change it basically to what they wanted it to be as the sort of world capital. And I think as for now, it seems to be again in a huge transition now, because it's rapidly becoming more expensive. And I think that's the main thing that's going to change that, because the types of people that you're going to try and attract basically with this bohemian style lifestyle, you can't really do that if it's so expensive that you're only going to attract very wealthy people to it. So I think, there's lots of people in Berlin that I know, kind of friends from childhood and so on, who are now either considering moving out or have already moved out because it's just not affordable anymore. And there's constant talk in the sort of more left-leaning papers about what the new Berlin is going to be. So all sorts of people get labeled with this thing, like Leipzig, for example, as a very young and kind of striving city with a very, very creative sort of scene, is now also labeled as the new Berlin. You hear it about places like Budapest, even Krakow. You hear it all the time about places that are supposed to be the new Berlin, because Berlin isn't quite the same anymore as it was even sort of 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, there's this famous thing even within Germany itself, because when it became the capital again in the late 90s of Germany, you suddenly had a lot of government people, diplomats and people like that moving in. Suddenly there was a lot more attention on building and what to build in Berlin, a lot more money as well. So there's also this kind of idea that Berlin is kind of taken over by outsiders, even when that's other Germans. The cliche has it that it's Swabians kind of taking over the city, because they're buying up a lot of property there, sort of South Germans.
That's interesting. We're not too far from Swabian Hill here in Budapest, Schwarzhead. So we're like
They're everywhere.
Yeah, they're everywhere. Absolutely colonizing. Well, I think that's all I've got. So I thought I would open the floor to anybody who has questions for Katja about East Germany or its legacy, or any of the very interesting details that she mentions in the book. And I don't think my microphone works, so yeah, there you go. Don't be shy.
Thank you.
I think in a way that may well be part of it, because basically you could join the FDJ, basically the youth organization of East Germany. It wasn't compulsory. It wasn't like the Hitler Youth. You didn't have to be in it. But there was some pressure to be in it nonetheless. And a lot of people wanted to be in it because they organized cultural events and trips and things like that. And for people like Angela Merkel, there was a choice to stay in it even longer, because she was a student for a long time, took her time really to do her PhD, and then ended up still at the age of 30, basically still being in the FDJ at the time. And that is certainly not a fact that she would want kind of pinned up and for everybody to talk about and to investigate. Furthermore, she was in a position that was called Secretary for Agitation and Propaganda, which sounds a lot worse than it is, because basically what it means is you're supposed to organize things like charity concerts for Nicaragua and stuff like that, which was propaganda in theory, but really in practice it means you could invite people like Bruce Springsteen into East Berlin, and that was organized by the FDJ, for example. So her role in this was to organize, events, concerts, trips and things like that. And I think for her, it was a way to get out of the GDR when you normally couldn't, basically. So she did these trips, for example, to Poland. She was fascinated with the Solidarność movement and sort of went to Poland a couple of times. She also did this kind of backpacking thing through the Soviet Union. All of this stuff doesn't look very good if you're trying to go to the pinnacle of what was then kind of still a West German dominated, still is a very West German dominated world. So I think that's kind of what she was actually talking about. Mention any of these things and you're immediately in a position where people will think, oh, you were responsible for agitation and propaganda, maybe not such a good look. And she was certainly not as opposition orientated as it was made out to be the case later. So when people were saying, oh, she's a pastor's daughter, and as a result of that, because it was a religious background, it must have been very difficult for her in East Germany. Nobody ever asked the question why her father actually went to live in the GDR. I mean, she was born in Hamburg. The family was from Hamburg, and her father, even then a kind of Protestant pastor, decided to kind of pick up his young family. Angela was, I think, something like 3 months old at the time, and he moved deliberately to East Germany, and he was known as the Red Pastor because he was part of a group of people who were quite who kind of combined Christianity and socialism. So there were these kind of socialist Christians, and he was one of them. And as I say, as a result of that, he was even known as the Red Pastor, or Red Kastner, because his last name was Kastner. So yes, all of these things are certainly not helpful when you're trying to put a political campaign together on the back end of what was then still a very Cold War mind. What I would say is that she does exemplify in that, again, this kind of complexity that people try to live with the world that they grew up in and try to make sense of it. In a way that she basically grew up in, and she hadn't ever known anything else, and that's not necessarily justifying it, but it does mean that that complexity is too much, and it wouldn't have worked at the time in the 90s, and certainly her career wouldn't have taken off the same way if her files hadn't all been locked away carefully and nobody had kind of gone on to look for these things.
Thank you. That was fascinating. My name is Patrick Egan. I'm the publisher of Brussels Signal, a news and commentary media brand. One of my questions for you is that, is regarding the political dynamism we're seeing in Germany now. I mean, if we look at Germany over the last several decades, since the end of the Second War, it's one of the countries, European countries, that's seen a great deal of political stability, at least for the last couple of decades, right? And for major parties that kind of decided the outcome of the government, right? But over the last few years, we have new parties on the scene that are really shaking things up. And back to one of your points in the beginning, we still see that division in the political map when we look at the electoral results. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, going beyond the labels of, when we look at AfD or the party of Sarah Wagenknecht, going beyond the parties of beyond the labels of far right and leftist, what is it in a little more nuanced or a subtle way that these particular the party of AfD, but also the leader Sarah Wagenknecht, where she's finding appeal? What is it that's drawing these voters to those new political movements in a country that has seen so much political stability over the last couple of decades? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting when you look at the way that East Germans vote and have voted over the last few sort of years and decades, that actually there was a lot of enthusiasm for the West German system in 1990 and shortly after. So in 1990, in their first free election, and when you think about this, is quite mad, really. So they had their first free election, East Germans, since 1932. And there was huge appetite for Western liberalism, democracy, and everything that people had kind of associated with West Germany by looking at it through this lens of they've just been watching like West German TV and that kind of stuff. So it's a very narrow window through which you kind of have to imagine what it's going to be like. And then, I think Helmut Kohl, as the West German Chancellor, overpromised a lot as well. He was famously talking about these sort of flowering landscapes, was the phrase that he used, that were going to spring out of nowhere in the East, and then quite the opposite happened. I mean, I remember kind of growing up in a really kind of grey, empty world where not much was going on. It was really quite depressing. And I don't know anybody from my whole year group that is actually still there where I grew up. So when I go back up, I go and visit my family, but there isn't anybody else there because there was nothing to keep you there. And they were kind of known as the baseball bat years because that anger and that frustration very quickly turned into political violence on the streets. So you had far-right group, far-left groups kind of springing up, my age group often, and a little bit older, who were so frustrated that they really literally resorted to violence. I had several friends that were beaten, into hospital just for being on the wrong street at the wrong point in time. So all of that, I think, meant that there's a generation, me and even younger than me, basically, who grew up not necessarily kind of shaped by the system that came before, but shaped by the lack of opportunity that came after. Who are now taking this out in elections and otherwise, basically on the existing political parties, because they don't feel that the political center ground has kind of done them any favors there. And I think the other thing that people got quite frustrated about is many of the intellectuals and dissidents imagined that there was going to be some sort of actual merger of the two Germanys, and that didn't happen. So from the beginning in the negotiations, the Western side, and one could argue whether that's right or wrong, what they did say, let's just assume we've got a system that works, and you are now allowed to join us. And that's kind of how it happened. And that meant in turn that all of the stuff that was nationalized previously, and that was something like 70% or so of the economy, was sold out very quickly to Western investors who had the money to buy these things. It wasn't really possible for East Germans to buy them because nobody had any wealth, really, because of the communist system being in place. And in the Oschmann book, for example, that I mentioned earlier, he gives an interesting statistic. I can't remember now the exact figure, but he says there's nowhere on earth where the people who live in a place own so little of the property and of the estates, basically, in their own area, because of the way that it was all bought up, and that includes housing and land and all sorts of things. And that again leads to a kind of idea that people were this was kind of done to them. And that backlash, I think you can still see as well in the way that people look left and right of the existing systems, basically to parties that talk to them. So the AfD and the Sarah Wagenknecht party on the left. And I say on the left because she's one of these odd hybrid parties that are kind of socially conservative, but left-wing on economic stuff and labor rights and those sorts of things. But both of these parties deliberately address East Germans, and their messaging kind of says to them, we're listening to you. And when I've been doing a lot of, because of this whole debate, and also because of the sort of elections coming up in East Germany, and next year it's the federal elections again. Because of that, I've been talking a lot to political parties who suddenly have discovered that, there's kind of a fifth of German voters that live in the East, and maybe they should make an effort to try and win some of those back over. And they sit there and basically say to me, entirely with West German, staff and advisors and so on, and they say, well, why are people so angry? And you try and explain it to them, and then they sort of get it. But they don't get the idea that maybe they should actually go there, show themselves, speak to people, pick up some of that anger and channel it. In particular, I think the CDU, the Conservative Party, could and should be doing that, because they used to be the strongest party in a lot of these regions, because people are, I think, on the whole, socially relatively conservative because of the way that the GDR was run, and just want a bit more stability and a bit more kind of support to deal with with these issues, because they have no financial safety net, basically, in the way that West Germans have. So I think all of these things kind of come together, and that's not to say that they're going to derail the entire kind of stable post-war order that you talked about. I think the constitution does provide a lot of checks and balances the way that it's set up, because it is set up deliberately as a very cynical constitution that assumes everybody's got it in for democracy. So it does allow for some very heavy-handed protection of democracy if need be. But it isn't really, at the moment there's talk in Germany about defending democracy, and that's the only kind of rhetoric that is being used, when I think it makes much more sense to think about why are people turning away from the established party. They're not against democracy as such. When you look at surveys, it's 90% of people, East and West, say that democracy is the right system. That's not the issue. The issue is that people feel they're not getting a choice that kind of addresses their own concerns, and I think that is a genuine danger to not just reunification, but kind of the whole system. When they were kind of never selling it to East Germans as something that is actually for them. They were just supposed to adapt to that. And in lots of ways, I think that applies to the European Union and the Eastern European states in a way as well. This idea that you have kind of a ready-made thing that was set up in the West, you're allowed to join, and then if there's any issues, don't complain to us because it used to work fine before you joined. So, it's that kind of logic, I think, that applies on both of these levels.
Thank you. So my question, I studied in Germany, engineering, but in Western Germany. And I was one day in Berlin in excursion with the students. And it was so absurd what I saw in one day that I asked myself, how is it possible? How is it possible that they are so far away from people's need, people's aspiration? For instance, in restaurants, at lunchtime, you had to queue up because they would close the restaurant because the staff would have the right to rest, during lunchtime. Fantastic. I mean, it is so far away from reason. It's simply unreasonable. So this is one point. But my question would be: I'm observing the decay of west of Germany for 20 years now, and is there not a big parallel in what you said? They were harassing your father because he made a joke, but today we have also the cancel culture, which means that, for instance, Hockey, the man of AFD, he's on trial because he said something like, "I give everything for Germany." This is forbidden. If you say something against Israel, you are an anti-Semite. You are bashed. You are kicked out of the institutions. And as the state took over such a huge part of economy, you better shut up. And so the question is: do we not face a new type of authoritarian regime, or even a kind of a dictate of opinions?
I do think that Germany is extremely heavy-handed with those things, and I think part of that is to do with its own history and with the way that it's trying to be sort of ultra-conscious of it to a point where it's trying to defend democracy by doing undemocratic things. So, there's constant talk, for instance, even now about actually banning the AfD. I mean, you're talking about a party that a fifth of the population wants to vote for, and a party that is now the second largest party in the country, and you're telling people, well, we can do this democracy thing, but only if you vote for the correct things. And I think that, you can look at Britain with the Brexit referendum, where there was a similar logic applied when people asked afterwards to repeat the referendum and say, well, maybe this time people will vote kind of for the correct option, as it were. I think these things are incredibly dangerous because they do always backfire. I think, the moment you try and tell people that they can't say something or they can't do something or this isn't a democratic choice, they go especially and vote for those parties, and even if you take it away, it doesn't work because people will find other ways of doing that. Ironically, and I've said this to SPD people as well, to the Social Democratic Party, who are currently on something like 15%, Olaf Scholz's party, and they're still pretending that they are the party of the people. They still go out there and say, we're the reasonable people, we're the people who are representing the majority view, and you're like, well, 15% isn't very much here. Can you think about the fact that you've come from sort of 40-odd% under Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt and those people in the 70s down to this, and there's a reason for that as well, and people need to acknowledge those concerns that people have, rather than kind of labeling them as fascists and whatnot if they disagree with them. So I do think that is certainly a big danger in German democratic culture at the moment, not just at the moment, has been for a long time, that they don't really dare kind of let other people speak and voice their concerns, and there's always a very heavy-handed approach. I mean, I've experienced with this with my book, where I've said to people, there were plenty of people, even former dissidents, who were trying to sort of say, I can't write this. There's pressure on the institutions that I work with to sort of not employ me anymore, get rid of me, or not let me speak anymore. And I said, can you not see the irony here? I'm writing a book about the GDR and you're telling me I can't say these things, even though they're true sometimes. People would say things like, well, you mentioned this in that episode, that may have happened, but, mentioning it is dangerous and you can't possibly say that because people might, come up with thoughts about it, or you're not condemning it harshly enough. And that is something that I think is very German in a way. There's this kind of anxiety there. that if they don't tell people what to think and what to say at each time, they're going to go off again, when actually the opposite is the case. I think people are going off left and right because they feel they're not allowed to say things and think things anymore.
Hi. So just following up on the previous question about kind of how Germany is still split. And when you look at life expectancy, when you look at wages, like it's really relevant that there's a really poor area, which is the Eastern, and much wealthier. Similar to the EU, how, you know, as you mentioned, Eastern European countries are kind of exploited by the West. And it's reflected, obviously, on politics and the AfD and Wagenknecht. But when you look at like the truckers or all these protests, you can see that some of the strikers are having like signs that say like, we want to go back to the, you know, the pre kind of, you know, before it was united, kind of, they want to go back to the socialist times. So don't you think that there is this kind of nostalgia of people that they thought it would be better and it didn't turn out to be better, like in loads of countries like Albania, loads of previous kind of socialist countries. And there's this kind of something that the West doesn't understand and they don't even try to understand, especially the English-speaking world. Don't you think that there's like a huge misunderstanding about kind of Germany and why people are voting for who they vote, and, you know, basically why the economy, like, basically they look at them as like Nazis or whatever, but they're actually just poor and they kind of prefer the previous system.
I think you're onto something in the sense that people don't understand that not everybody was deeply unhappy living the other side of the Iron Curtain, if you will, and people haven't really understood, I think, why some people found that small world that they lived in at the time, that there was some safety to that as well, because ultimately, especially for the working classes, there were some things that, you know, you just didn't have to worry about, things like paying your bills, or whether you could afford your rent, whether your child could go to university, that sort of thing from a financial point of view. And that, I think, wasn't on people's radar when they were happy to kind of, you know, westernize and become part of that world. I don't think they understood that freedom also comes with risk, and also with kind of an imbalance in opportunities, so that social mobility isn't an automatic granted thing that works the same for everyone. And I think, you know, this links into what I said earlier about people in Western societies kind of being used to that and growing up in a world where that is the case, whilst people who have joined that with a hugely exaggerated expectation about what it's going to be like, also have a long way to fall in terms of their disappointments. And I think that is something that is little understood by people who haven't actually lived in it. I mean, I'm somebody who's only kind of worked this out by talking to people, because I didn't grow up in it either. But I have grown up kind of within a weird sort of almost classless system still in the 1990s. So when I went to grammar school, which is something quite, you know, kind of elitist in a lot of other countries, the way that children are chosen, my school was trying to survive because it had only just been set up in 1990, so it was taking in absolutely everybody who applied, so it was supposed to be selective and wasn't. And as a result of that, I went to school with people who were, you know, like me, the sort of child of a teacher, but also with people who were, you know, the children of builders or plumbers or whatever. And as a result of that, there wasn't really a class kind of element to the way that we interacted with each other, because we were used to doing the same thing that our parents had done, who'd lived in the same housing blocks together, regardless of whether you're an architect or a taxi driver. And it only occurred to me when I went to university, and suddenly we had this, because I was in Jena, which is in Thuringia and just over the border from Bavaria, so we had lots of Bavarian students coming to the university. And suddenly I realized, actually, you know, these people, they speak differently, they are different, they look down upon you when you don't know, which fork to use in a fancy restaurant or something, or the way that you speak, the way that you act, you just don't really fit in. And that is something that didn't really exist in the same way behind the Iron Curtain. Of course, you had people with privileges and people who struggled to get to places because of who they were or what family they were from. But it was done in a different way. You'd struggle because your parents were dissidents or were coming from a family that the authorities were suspicious of. It wasn't really along class lines as such anymore, not in the 1980s anymore, not to the same degree. So I think all of those things I think are worth understanding without being nostalgic about them. It's just kind of understanding people's mind frames and where they come from. If you want to understand why they're now disillusioned, a lot of people. I would push back a little bit against the idea that people are nostalgic to the point where they want the old system back, because most of the surveys show that that's about 10% or so, certainly for East Germany. I don't know if that's the case for other Eastern European countries. But they did a big survey in 2019, 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall in Germany, and there were only 10% of East Germans who said that they want East Germany back as such, but there were over 70 or so % of people who said that there were some aspects of East German life that they thought were worth considering and worth keeping in mind. And also when they asked West Germans, over half of them said the same thing, which I thought was interesting. So there were people basically even in West Germany who were willing to consider the possibility that some stuff may have worked. In the book I've got this interesting episode where Erich Honecker, the second leader of the GDR, meets Strauss, the Bavarian minister president, who was the ultimate Cold Warrior. He was very, very, sort of not a penny to the GDR and all of that. And in the end, obviously organized a kind of loan deal of money from West Germany to the GDR. But the two families met up in East Germany, and Frau Strauss, so his wife, actually said to Honecker's wife that she thinks that the childcare system in the GDR is worth looking at because it actually allows women to work, and she wishes it was possible, particularly in ultra-conservative Bavaria, to say these things without being branded as a communist, basically, because it's an aspect of the other system that was worth looking at. And I think this kind of knee-jerk reaction every time you do that, when people say, oh, you're a communist, when you point out one thing that sort of worked, that's unhelpful when you're dealing with people who've kind of made these experiences and want them treated seriously.
After World War II, there was an effort to denazify and deprussify. Deprussification is a little less spoken about, but it was still part of the rebuilding effort. When the wall came down, was there an effort to decomify, if that's a term? Or how did that sort of take it or leave it merger actually go down? How did it take place?
Yeah, there was. I mean, I think they were quite conscious of the fact, and maybe this isn't unlike the situation after the American Civil War as well, that you had to live with the fact that there were now kind of two different experiences within the same nation, and you have to find a way of making that work. And without some form of reconciliation, if you kind of completely alienate that society, I think there was an understanding that that would have gone very wrong if they'd done that. But they certainly put a lot of the leaders on trial. If you wanted to work in any government or kind of higher positions in education or anywhere like that, you needed the same thing actually as after the Second World War. You needed one of those Persil sort of documents, so a thing that showed that you were clean, basically, and that was the same thing. So if you wanted to work as a civil servant, say, you needed to show that you've never worked with the Stasi, that there wasn't any sort of documents to show that you've worked with the previous regime in order to do that. Having said that, a lot of the people who worked as informal informants were listed in the Stasi under like a code name, and so it wasn't always obvious who was who. So for years on end, you had these sort of scandals coming up where a politician would stand for office. Then, journalists would try and find out stuff about them, and they would find out that in, 1985, they'd grassed up a fellow student or whatever, or a colleague, for, their own personal gain, or because they were threatened or cursed into doing that, and then that would be the end of their career as well, quite often. So it was kind of a mix. They were trying on the whole to say to East Germans, well, it wasn't your fault, this was a foreign occupation, it was never really accepted that East Germany was even a country. It was still called the zone, as in the occupation zone. So in many ways, this kind of narrative that it was a foreign thing that was done to East Germans was used to try and say, well, we understand this now that you're liberated, you can join us, but not if you had kind of gone out of your way to make an effort to support the regime. So there was an attempt to try and find a solution that was maybe not quite the same as after the Second World War, but the principles, I would say, were similar. In that Adenauer tried kind of similar things and trying to get civil servants and people like that back in where they could be integrated into the system rather than all expelled, which of course is highly controversial today, but that was kind of his strategy as well. So in a way, I would say it's not dissimilar to what happened then. And actually, sorry, one more point on that. There's actually an organization set up called the Bundesstiftung Aufarbeitung. So they basically deal with the legacy of the GDR, and it's got a state-funded and kind of literally a legal obligation to kind of rake through GDR history, for lack of a better word. If you look into their founding statute, that it's not their task to deal with the whole of GDR history. It's all about the victims and memorizing their story, which is why they're hugely opposed to this book that I've written about kind of the mainstream society, really, because they think that all of these people are either sort of sick for doing that or part of the problem, basically. So if you were a dissident in 1986 and the whole of society was kind of like, well, this is sort of working, we're not really, joining in, and the rest of the population only joined in 1989, they hated the majority of society at the time and still do. So there is this organization that tries to deal with this, but I think that's in a way part of the problem, because the majority of former GDR citizens don't feel represented by them, so their books don't sell, people don't really go to the exhibitions, the documentaries aren't being watched. So a lot of money is basically being invested in this, but it's unclear who they actually speak to apart from to each other, and that's been part of the issue, I think, in dealing with this, that there wasn't an invitation to everybody to say what they've experienced, talk about it, discuss whether that was the right thing to do or not, because you kind of felt that there were repercussions for your career if you did, as per Angela Merkel, as we've discussed earlier.
Yes, my name is Frank Spengler. I'm born in West Germany, 60 kilometers away from the Iron Curtain. So I have a lot of family in the East, and we travel quite often to Erfurt and other places. Actually, even more than we do nowadays, funny enough. And my stepsister, she was not a socialist at all, but she always said, one day we will surpass you. We have to work harder because of the system and so on, but there was a lot of hope. And maybe she was a victim of the propaganda in the East, but only 1988, she said, it's finished. We lost hope. And that was a tremendous change in the argumentation. And when I came back to the West, I said the GDR is finished. Nobody believed it because we had quite a different picture of the East. And when the demonstrations started, the Dissidents' slogan was, "We are the people." So they wanted a German state, a socialist state, not so much unification. Only later on, we are one people. Then there was tremendous pressure from the street. So there was no textbook solution of merging two different systems. And we made a lot of mistakes, and I don't want to defend that. But there was, as I said, a lot of pressure from the people, high expectations. There was pressure from outside. You know that in the neighborhood there were countries who were not so happy to have one Germany. And Helmut Kohl was...
Britain being the most extreme example. Thatcher certainly had sleepless nights about this.
We don't want to mention that. But he was courageous enough to start a transformation process. And I think we're still in a transformation form. So your next book, the 30 years after 89, is maybe more interesting, because then we can learn more maybe from the transformation process, which was wrong, which could be avoided. And then we can help our Korean friends, because we get a lot of delegations from Korea. I wanted to know how they could manage a unification of that two separate countries. And let's wait for the next book.
The book's just coming out in South Korea, and I'm supposed to write a foreword for it. I've started and stopped about 20 times. I don't know what to tell them. But just quickly on the point of people changing their attitudes in 1989 even. I was doing a talk in Guben, actually, where I was born a few months ago. And there was this woman who literally stood there with tears in her eyes, and she said, "We were betrayed by the working classes." She was an East German intellectual who said that she was part of this, this whole reform movement, and she said, "We didn't want unification. We wanted a state that had kind of a democratic form of socialism." I still think that's incredibly naive. I don't see how that was ever supposed to have worked. Having two Germanys with an open border, you would have had literally the same problem as East Germany did after 1990, when a quarter of the entire population left, myself included, but lots of people did. And it just doesn't work. But at the same time, she stood there and she said, well, we were fighting for this kind of big idea of reform, of getting rid of the old system, but creating something that was still us, that was still our country, something that we'd achieved. And then ordinary people, basically the working classes, as she phrased it, the very people that she thought she was doing this for, voted for quick reunification, and the parties that made this offer, of course, won the majority in the 1990 election. Helmut Kohl was immensely popular, as you say, and had to do this quickly. I mean, quite famously, he changed what was originally a 10-year plan to a 10-point plan, almost overnight, basically on the back of a napkin, didn't tell anybody about it, and then put it in front of the Bundestag and said, well, do you want unification or what? And then people had to basically vote with it, because to vote against it would have been to vote against German reunification and against, as you say, the pressure from the streets in East Germany, where people were out there in their hundreds of thousands, by then shouting, we are one people, meaning we want unification. So I certainly don't underestimate the pressures that were there at the time, both from the streets themselves and also just the international situation, as you say. I mean, Thatcher literally thought the Third Reich was coming again, and worries about that. You had the US was all in favor of it. They liked it, but that was pretty much the only party of the four powers. The French, as you can imagine, having a reunified Germany again on the continent took some convincing, and certainly a lot of EU sort of based arguments about merging the two states together, and the Russians needed a lot of money to think that was a good idea. But one way or another, the moment was right then, and if it had dragged out, I think, for the 10 years that were originally planned, a lot more people would have had time to voice their reservations, and it would have become a very different thing. So that is all taken on board, but I don't think it changes the anger and the disaffection that is out there in East Germany, and the way that now still manifests itself such a long time after. I mean, even when I wrote this book, there are people sort of rolling their eyes and going, do you have to go on about this again, like it was done, dusted? When my argument is always, well, we still talk about the Middle Ages or the Reformation or whatever, these things don't just go away because we want them to. But I think that's part of the problem, that people kind of said, well, it was what it was, and you just have to deal with it now, rather than trying to find ways of addressing it, both psychologically and in terms of, I don't know, economic policies and so on and so forth. And the argument that you usually get from people when you speak to sort of West Germans about it is quite often that, so and so much money, billions literally, were invested in it, into East Germany, and that is true. And when you go there now, it certainly looks a lot better. So you go to places like, I don't know, Görlitz on the Polish border, and it was absolutely hideous when I grew up. My grandmother lived right next to it, and she used to go to the hairdressers for like 3 marks or something, because it was so poor. It had unemployment rates of over 50%. And now it's kind of become this pensioners city. A lot of money has been invested in restoring the housing, the historical housing stock and so on. And it certainly looks a lot better. But again, it doesn't mean that the people who live there feel better about the situation, about their economic prospects and so on. And I think that's all part of the issue, that we just need to address this openly and without people fearing that they can't say things. Yeah, it's also an e-book and an audiobook and every other book. Yeah.
As I understand it, the current German political system was designed by the Allies after the Second World War, very specifically to prevent what happened then happening again. So it's built on consensus. I've sat many days in meetings with Germans wondering why things take so long. And it's to make sure that consensus is achieved. So my question is the current political system still fit for purpose? Is it either preventing dangerous things happening or frustrating the necessary changes that need to be made to accommodate changed times? How flexible is it, etc.?
Yeah, that is a very good question, because Germans are, I think, quite obsessed with this idea of consensus, and rightly so, because of their historical legacy. I think that worked well in the 50s and 60s when there was a broad consensus in society about where things were going. You had the economic miracle basically backing this up, and everybody felt that it was going in the right direction. I mean, Konrad Adenauer in his second term is the only kind of post-war chancellor who achieved an absolute majority in a system that is, largely still proportional representation, even though it has got first past the post elements in it. But that's quite astonishing. That means there was a broad consensus when over 50% of the people say, yes, this is the right choice. And with sky high kind of turnout still at the time as well. So I think that's why it worked at the time, because basically negotiating meant that at best, you go to the liberals and you say to the, to the FDP, and you basically say to them, well, okay, if we must, we'll have some laws here that protect freedom of speech, because you're clearly keen on that. So it pushed Adenauer a little bit further away from his quite autocratic way of doing things, and that was kind of the compromise. It was 90% or 95% what Adenauer wanted and what most of the people wanted. And then it had a little bit of elements in where it pushed the main party one way or the other. And later you see this again, under the SPD as well, when they come in the 70s under Willy Brandt and then Schmidt, is that they kind of have to do similar things. They couldn't go too far on their left-wing policies on the economy because of the FDP kind of saying, well, that's going too far. But again, it was mostly them and then just a little bit. Whilst now, when you have the first three-way system coming in, basically with the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and the Greens trying to run a progressive thing together, it doesn't really work, because they're obviously completely different when it, for instance, comes to the war in Ukraine. The Greens are really quite hawkish at this point now, pushing for what they call a principled foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia, but also China. Meanwhile, you got the SPD with their, historically very pro-Russian views and their stance, and that just doesn't work together. Olaf Scholz is reputed to have said when he went into the negotiations and sent his people in there, avoid the worst. And that's obviously not an attitude when you're forming a new coalition, to kind of go in there and not constructively think what can we do, but it's kind of like how can we avoid them getting too much of a say. And I think because of that you end up with this kind of wishy-washy policy that is middle of the road and doesn't please anybody, and that's what's been happening, I think, for a long time now. Because you saw even Angela Merkel pulling the Conservative Party so far to the center that it was almost indistinguishable for a time from the Social Democratic Party, and then those two forming a grand coalition together in the center, not doing one thing or the other. I think greatly displeased people, because they felt that they had no option other than to vote for slight variations of kind of the same thing when they were voting for the political parties. And I think people kind of accepted that up until 2015, because it wasn't really going so, it was okay basically. Most people were grumbling about stuff, but nothing was drastic enough to make people unhappy about that. And then the refugee crisis hit. And suddenly people who were worried about that had nowhere to go politically, because if you look at the political spectrum, it was completely unbalanced at that point. You basically had sort of right of the CDU, there was nothing until you arrived at the AfD, and they were still quite a very different party from what they're now basically at the time, not least in terms of their infrastructure. They just didn't have, kind of the professional setup in the way that other people did. So, that for the first time made people think, well, what am I supposed to do to voice my concerns about mass immigration? I can't vote for the Conservative Party because they've done this under Angela Merkel. And if I go further to the left, I kind of confirm this even more. I'm signaling to the politicians that I want more immigration rather than less. And that's for the first time, I think, broken that post-war consensus big style, because people were thinking, right, fine, I'll go to the far right then, to the other end of the spectrum and vote for them. And instead of thinking about why that is, and this is the thing that I don't get, the CDU kind of didn't sit there for a minute under Angela Merkel and think, well, maybe people are genuinely concerned about this. It was all about, we haven't communicated this correctly, we just need to make it clear to people that diversity is the way forward and this is what we should be doing. Instead of thinking people are really concerned here about all sorts of things, really, from the facilities that they're using to the huge social transformation that is underway, particularly in the East, that was almost kind of completely homogenous still as a society at that point. And suddenly, container villages were set up everywhere where refugees were being housed, and it really changed the way that people saw their communities. None of this was discussed as such in public because the people who had concerns about it and would have been able to voice them in a reasonable manner didn't, because they felt they couldn't. And as a result of that anger was taken to the streets. People radicalized, people talked amongst each other. I've got family in 3 different East German states, and every time I go back, people are even more angry. People are getting into all sorts of conspiracy theory territory. COVID made this a lot more intense than it was before, because people, literally were just talking amongst each other about stuff, were looking things up on the internet because they don't trust the mainstream media anymore. And it just goes down this spiral. And instead of reacting to this, mainstream politicians are kind of shutting their ears and eyes to this, in my view, and are hoping it's just going to go away if you get better communication strategy, when the core issue is the issue itself, not the way that you're communicating it. And I think that's the big problem that's changed the Cold War, or post-war basically, consensus, and that was set up because Adenauer reflected what the majority wanted. I don't think the current political system does.
It is sometimes said that Pope John Paul II played an important part in the fall of the Iron Wall, and I would like to know if religion played an important part in former East Germany, either Protestant or Catholic, during this process of reunification.
I think it did, in the sense that a lot of the dissidents used the church networks, both Catholic and Protestant, to communicate with one another and to organize action. So, for example, there was the famous Environment Library, which was set up in Berlin in a church, and basically that provided some cover because the GDR regime was quite reluctant to directly go for the churches. It had kind of reached this uneasy relationship, almost uneasy truce with the churches, where it was like, well, you don't preach too heavily against us, and we'll leave the churches be, and some of the church schools and so on. And as a result of that, they were reluctant to go for the churches directly, which allowed them to provide sort of a cover for the dissidents to work within, without being too heavily punished, because they had a very powerful network behind them. It also allowed the churches to communicate with the churches in West Germany, and therefore organize things as well, because they were talking to each other and could organize, for instance, people that wanted to leave the GDR. That was more easily done through the churches than on your own, because the pressure was there, and there were absurd things that I talk about in the book as well, the so-called sort of people smuggling thing going on, whereby the GDR would basically arrest somebody, and then a West German organization, often the churches, would buy them free. And sometimes, it was sort of tens of thousands of marks per person that they'd pay. And everybody knew about this, so the East German regime thought, brilliant way of making some hard currency. The churches on both sides knew about it, and they each had negotiators set up on both sides who worked with one another for years. So it was literally like identifying people who had powerful people on the other side, that they could kind of mobilize or kind of raise the funds basically to do it. And that was also often organized through the churches. So they did play a role. I think people have underestimated, in hindsight, how much or how little support they actually still had in the population. So, East Germany is sometimes called the most godless place on earth because it's got such high rates of atheism, because once that religious kind of way of life is gone, it is gone. It doesn't tend to sort of come back. Once the society stops being religious, it stops being religious. And I think that's, people kind of imagined that in 1990 everybody would flock back to the churches and finally be free to join them and all of that, and that didn't happen. It's quite the contrary. I think we're on something like 13% of people now in East Germany who actually officially belong to a religion. It's very, very low. I'm a classic example of that. I grew up completely, and it's sometimes hard to explain really to people who aren't from East Germany that you haven't made a conscious decision to be an atheist. You say that to people and they think, oh, you must be a progressive left-leaning intellectual or something, because it's often associated with that. But it's at no point in my life did I sit down and think, oh, I stopped believing in God now, or I leave the church. It just wasn't ever a part of my life to start with, and it's therefore quite difficult to sit there at some point and decide, actually, the explanation that I have for everything isn't enough, and I'm going to go back and kind of join a religion of some sort because you just grew up without it completely. And I think that applies to society on the whole. So even, when you look at the society in the 1980s, it wasn't the case that most people felt they couldn't go to church. At that point, things had been eroded so much, not least because it was a Protestant society to start with, and therefore perhaps a bit easier to do than in Catholic countries. That I don't think that was ever going to come back. So they did play a role, but not to the extent I think that people think. And plus you do have people like Angela Merkel's family as an example of that, where the churches themselves that kind of found their way to deal with the regime as well.
You mentioned your mother was a teacher, and I'm kind of curious about some of the rituals of political indoctrination that existed within schools. I think in the West there's kind of this mentality of children blindly saluting portraits of the leader or something like that, this sort of brainwashing. But I'm really curious what it was actually like for teachers and students sort of on the ground, what that experience was like. And particularly, I'm interested if you think it was fundamentally different than some of the patriotic rituals that might exist in Western schools at the primary or secondary level.
I would say that it was certainly very, very heavy on the propaganda side and very politicized. Because when you look at the curriculum that was established, basically it goes all the way from kindergarten age, because people also, because childcare was provided so that women could work, basically we all joined very, very early as well. And that came with all sorts of things. It was kind of like your whole life that was bound up with that, because if your mother worked full time or both of your parents worked full time, you're kind of in state hands basically for most of the day. So to give you one example, I was 2.5 years old when somebody decided that I'm sort of quite compact and therefore a good gymnast. So I was put into this gymnastics program with the view to kind of elite sport kind of route at that age, without me saying anything about that or getting a say in it, or my parents really being particularly interested in it, because that was just considered what your child did kind of during the day wasn't really your concern as such, because you'd kind of grown up in the same way yourself as a mother and didn't think much of it. So these things existed, and one of the things, for instance, that they were trying to do is make the whole society quite militaristic to start with. So everybody took part in like defense courses, men and sort of girls and boys as well. And at a certain point in their school career, you'd go off to like sort of camps and march around in uniforms, and you'd have to wear sort of NBC suits and those kinds of things, to practice civil defense. If you were a woman or if you were a man, you'd kind of get into sort of military training. But so those things ran all the way through, and they were quite political in that respect, of course. On the flip side, I would say that, apart from that, teachers still had, they were still humans, and they still dealt with their students accordingly, and there was still a connection between like your teachers and the class, basically. So if they thought somebody genuinely had talent and they could move forward, then they would try and basically help them and push them on. I've got an example in the book where a girl was sent a jeans skirt, a denim skirt from her Western relatives, and original Levi's of all things. So that was, the best thing ever that you could get hold of. And she decided to wear this with her FDJ blouse, with the blue blouse of the youth movement. So that later that was fine. You could do that in the 80s, but you couldn't do it at the time. That was still in the 70s, because you're basically like walking around as you're like a symbol of the class struggle, really, with that. And she was previously kind of considered a model student by her school. So she was immediately called in by her teacher and said, what are you doing wearing this? I wouldn't have thought that of you, of all people, and she felt like she'd just been slapped in the face, basically. And yet the teacher decided that, she was a young teenager at that point, and had made a mistake, so be it, and just continued to sort of further her and give her one of the, you could only have 2 people from each class basically go on to do higher education, and she decided still to push her that way, because she came from a sort of working class family and was very bright, and then it was decided that she should go on basically and carried on getting support from there. So again, I would say it's more complex than than just to say it was kind of just propaganda and everybody hated it. It depends who you speak to, whether they liked or didn't like the education on offer. A lot of people had genuine issues with the defense education because it was extremely physical. So if you were kind of a bookish type or a bit, or a pacifist really, and you're suddenly put in a position where you're supposed to kind of, crawl through the mud and beat your fellow students over the head with things, it's maybe not an ideal experience for you. So some of the boys, you could have an option where you basically said you refused to do that, and then you were put into the girls' course, which of course isn't necessarily what you want when you're 15, and there's a lot of pressure there. But that was something that you could also do. But then again, you risk kind of not being picked for the university places. So there was constant pressure as such, but again, also ways to find niches and ways around that. As for my mum, I think one of the things that people forget, is when you think about my age, my mum was still quite young at the time as well, and she'd only taught for, I want to say 3 years or something. I think she was still at university when she had me, and then sort of started teaching in 87, 88, something like that. So she's still a teacher now. So when people say to me, she was the system supporting person, I always ask which system, given that she's kind of still doing that. And that's what fascinated me about my own teachers as well in the 90s. How do you deal with that? You get basically told, especially as she's a history teacher as well, you kind of get told that, you're teaching history as a kind of Marxist version where you start really with Spartacus and the ancient period as a kind of history of class struggle, and you go through things like the Civil War and the 30 Years War in Europe, those kinds of things, and they're all seen through this lens. And then suddenly in 1990 somebody tells you, that's all rubbish. Can you teach the proper history now? And you kind of just go along and do it. I've never understood how that's a thing, but most people did somehow do that, or they'd find completely different careers, but often not by choice, but because they had to. Their old jobs didn't exist anymore. So my dad, for instance, that middle officer corps, middle ranking sort of thing, so he was a captain, so that kind of group was particularly targeted for kind of purging, I guess, if you want to call it that. But they were all offered, at least on paper, that they could join, or most of them were, that they could join the Bundeswehr, the West German army. But it always came with caveats that you might not necessarily want to do. So for him, they basically said that he could be placed anywhere within the whole of Germany. And him having me as a, sort of 4 or 5 year old at the time, and my sister was born in 1990, he didn't really fancy the idea of kind of being placed somewhere in Bavaria or elsewhere. And also he said to me he wasn't entirely sure at the time whether he could have flipped that easily. Basically, you're told to do a certain thing for a certain time for a certain reason, and then suddenly NATO isn't the enemy anymore, but you're joining kind of NATO forces. So to him it just seemed like, suddenly a different flag's kind of up on your base and you're supposed to kind of do a different thing, and it took him a while to sort of adapt to that, I think. Having said that, he became a lifelong voter of the Liberal Party because he hated so much the idea that, you were told how to think and what to do, and that experience of being put in prison for a joke did that as well. So again, people dealt with that in different ways. But that propaganda was certainly underpinning everything, but whether you took it seriously or not was kind of up to the individual.
Thanks so much for your attention. Thanks for coming, and thank you most of all to Katja for her time. So we give her a round of applause.
Thank you.